The richest girl in New York went shopping and was never seen again. Picture this. It's December 12th, 1910. Fifth Avenue, New York City. The most famous street in the most powerful city in the world. It's a bright, cold Monday afternoon. The sun is out, thousands of people are walking the sidewalks, policemen are on every corner, and the stores are packed with Christmas shoppers. In the middle of all of this, a 25-year-old woman stops to chat with a friend outside a bookstore. She's laughing. She's well-dressed. She's in, by all accounts, a perfectly good mood. Then she says goodbye, turns towards Central Park, and walks into one of the most impenetrable mysteries in American history. Her name was Dorothy Arnold. She was the daughter of one of New York's wealthiest families. She had money, connections, education, and a future that most people in 1910 could only dream of. And yet, from that moment on the sidewalk outside Brentano's books, she was never seen again. Not by a single credible witness, not by her family, not by the most famous detective agency in America, who spent months and thousands of dollars searching for her. Not by anyone. And here's what makes this story even stranger. Her own family hid the disappearance from police for over a month. A full month. While their daughter, their flesh and blood, was missing. Why? That question is still unanswered, and it has been haunting this case for over 114 years. This is the story of Dorothy Arnold, and by the end, I guarantee you won't be able to stop thinking about it. To understand this mystery, you first need to understand the world Dorothy Arnold existed in, because it was a world so different from ours that it might as well be another planet. New York City in 1910 was the epicenter of American wealth and ambition. The Gilded Age was technically winding down, but you wouldn't know that walking down Fifth Avenue. The mansions that lined the Upper East Side were temples to old money. Families like the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers. These weren't just rich families. They were American royalty. They had rules, codes, expectations that were as rigid and unforgiving as any royal court in Europe. The Arnold family was part of this world. Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold was born on July 1, 1885, at 108 East 79th Street, a 5-story brownstone mansion in the heart of Manhattan's most exclusive neighborhood. Her father, Francis R. Arnold, was a wealthy fine goods importer. Her mother, Mary, was equally well connected. And if their money wasn't impressive enough, consider this. The Arnolds traced their lineage directly back to the Mayflower, and Francis's own sister had married Supreme Court Justice Rufus Peckham. These people were not just rich, they were important. They had a reputation to protect, and in their world, reputation was everything. Worth more than money, worth more than happiness, possibly worth more than one of their own children. Dorothy grew up in this gilded cage. She was educated at the best schools, attended the finest parties, and was expected, like every other girl of her class, to follow a very simple script. Finish school, find a suitable husband from a similarly prestigious family, get married, have children, host dinner parties, and live out her days in comfortable, respectable obscurity. But Dorothy Arnold had different ideas. She had graduated from Bryn Mawr College, one of the most rigorous women's colleges in America, with a degree in literature. And she had come home not looking for a husband, but looking for something far more dangerous in 1910 New York. A career. Specifically, she wanted to be a writer. Now, you might be thinking, what's the big deal? People pursue writing careers all the time. But in 1910, for a woman of Dorothy's class and background, this was almost scandalous. Women of the Arnold family's social standing did not work. They did not pursue careers. The very idea that an Arnold girl would submit stories to a magazine, competing with professional writers, potentially getting paid, was, in her family's eyes, somewhere between embarrassing and humiliating. And her family made sure she knew it. When Dorothy submitted her short stories to McClure's magazine, one of the most prestigious literary publications of the era, and received rejection after rejection, her family didn't comfort her. They laughed at her. According to multiple accounts from her friends, the Arnolds found Dorothy's writing ambitions deeply amusing. Her rejection letters were a source of gentle mockery at the family dinner table. So Dorothy started hiding things. She rented a private post office box, without telling her parents, to receive correspondence from publishers and magazines. She continued submitting stories in secret. She continued dreaming in secret. And then she started doing something else in secret too. His name was George Griscom, Jr. And if the Arnold family had known everything about him from the start, they would have shut this relationship down immediately. Griscom was 40 years old, 15 years older than Dorothy. He was a Harvard-educated bachelor from Pittsburgh, who, despite his expensive education and impressive family connections, had no job, no career, and no apparent ambition to get one. He was heavy-set, with mutton-chop sideburns that were already going out of fashion, and, this detail is almost too good, he still lived with his elderly parents. When his parents traveled, he traveled with them. One newspaper report from the era noted that his doting mother still bought all his shirts and ties. This was the man who had captured Dorothy Arnold's heart. How they met is not entirely clear, likely through their overlapping social circles around Bryn Mawr. But by 1910, their relationship had become serious. Serious enough that, at some point, they had apparently considered themselves engaged, though neither family had officially acknowledged this. Dorothy's parents found out about Griscom and were not pleased. They considered him entirely unsuitable for their daughter. He had no money of his own, no prospects, no visible future. He was exactly the kind of man they had raised Dorothy to avoid. So they forbade the relationship. Dorothy, to all outward appearances, obeyed. In reality, she kept seeing him. She kept writing him letters. And in September 1910, just 3 months before her disappearance, she pulled off something that was either romantic or deeply reckless, depending on how you look at it. Dorothy told her parents she was going to visit a former classmate in Boston. That was a lie. What she actually did was pawn $500 worth of her own jewelry, a small fortune in 1910, equivalent to roughly $17,000 today, and use the money to fund a secret, week-long stay with Griscom at the Hotel Essex in Boston. A week, alone, with a man, in a hotel. In 1910 New York society, this was not just scandalous. This was potentially catastrophic. If word got out, Dorothy's reputation would have been destroyed. Marriage prospects would have evaporated. The entire Arnold family would have faced social humiliation. But somehow, this secret held, at least for a while. When Dorothy returned from Boston, her parents eventually discovered the truth. Perhaps from the pawned jewelry, perhaps from a private inquiry. They confronted her, forbade her absolutely from continuing the relationship, and made it clear that George Griscom was not welcome in their daughter's life. But here's the thing about Dorothy Arnold. She was a woman living inside a cage built from wealth and respectability, and she was looking for every possible window she could find.
In October 1910, she asked her father for permission to rent an apartment in Greenwich Village, the bohemian, artistic neighborhood where young, creative New Yorkers were forging new ways of living. She wanted to write. She wanted independence. She wanted a life that was actually hers. Her father's response was dismissive and final. A good writer can write anywhere, and no daughter of his was going to live alone in Greenwich Village. Then, in November 1910, McClure's magazine rejected her second story, a piece called The Poinsettia Flames. In a letter to Griscom, written just weeks before she disappeared, Dorothy poured out her despair. Her exact words, preserved in the historical record, are heartbreaking. "Failure stares me in the face. All I can see ahead is a long road with no turning. Mother will always think an accident has happened." Read that last sentence again. Mother will always think an accident has happened. Investigators, journalists, and historians have spent over a century debating what exactly Dorothy meant by those words. Was she telling Griscom she was planning to disappear? Was she expressing suicidal thoughts? Or was it simply a young woman venting her frustration with no deeper meaning at all? Nobody knows. What we do know is that 2 weeks after writing that letter, on the morning of Monday, December 12, 1910, Dorothy Arnold got dressed, put $30 in her purse, equivalent to about $1,000 today, and told her mother she was going shopping. She would never come home. December 12, 1910, was a cold but brilliantly sunny Monday in Manhattan. Dorothy rose that morning and informed her mother, Mary, that she intended to go shopping for a dress to wear to her younger sister Marjorie's upcoming debutante party, one of the most important social events in the Arnold family's calendar. She dressed carefully that morning. A tailored suit, a blue serge coat, a tight hobble skirt in a matching color, an enormous silver fox fur muff to keep her hands warm, and a fashionable hat that would have made her immediately recognizable on the street. By the standards of 1910 New York, she was dressed to be noticed. There was one small detail that investigators would later fixate on. Dorothy left behind her jewels, her extra clothes, and most significantly, her passport. If she had been planning to travel, or to flee, or to elope, why leave the passport behind? She said goodbye to her mother, stepped out into the cold December air, and began walking down Fifth Avenue. Her first stop, sometime in the late morning, was a high-end grocery store called Park and Tilford, where she charged a half-pound of chocolates to her father's account. The cashier remembered her clearly. Then she walked south, 32 blocks south, to Brentano's bookshop at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 27th Street, near Madison Square Park. At Brentano's, she browsed the shelves and purchased a book of humorous short stories. The clerk remembered the transaction. Then she walked outside. And here, on the sidewalk in front of Brentano's books, is the last moment we can place Dorothy Arnold with absolute certainty. She ran into a friend, a woman named Gladys King, on the sidewalk outside the store. The two women stopped and chatted. Gladys King later told investigators that Dorothy had seemed perfectly fine, cheerful even. She was in what Gladys described as good spirits. There was nothing strange about her behavior, nothing that suggested distress or anxiety or any intention of disappearing. The two women talked for a few minutes. Then Dorothy said she was going to walk home through Central Park. They said goodbye. Dorothy turned and walked north. And that was it. That was the last confirmed sighting of Dorothy Arnold, anywhere in the world, by anyone who knew her. She was 25 years old. She was on one of the busiest streets in the most populated city in America. It was the middle of a sunny afternoon,
and she walked straight into a mystery that has never been solved. The distance from 5th Avenue and 27th Street to the 59th Street entrance of Central Park, the most direct route home, was about 1.5 miles. A leisurely walk, even in heeled shoes. Somewhere in those 32 blocks of the most surveilled, populated street in New York City, Dorothy Arnold disappeared. No one saw her fall. No one heard her scream. No one reported a struggle. She was simply gone. That evening, when Dorothy failed to appear for dinner, her mother grew concerned. Her father grew concerned. But they waited. Maybe she had stopped to see a friend. Maybe she had lost track of time. By midnight, she still hadn't come home. And here is where the story takes its darkest, most revealing turn. Dorothy Arnold's family did not call the police. Not that night. Not the next day. Not for weeks. Think about that. Your daughter, your 25-year-old daughter, who has never done anything like this before, fails to come home on a cold December night. And your first instinct is to call a lawyer? Because that's exactly what Frances Arnold did. The morning after Dorothy disappeared, December 13th, 1910, Frances Arnold contacted the family's attorney, John S. Keith. Together, they decided to handle this quietly, privately, and above all else, without involving the newspapers. Their reasoning is deeply revealing. The Arnold family was not primarily concerned in those first critical hours and days with finding Dorothy. They were primarily concerned with protecting the family name. If the press found out that Dorothy had vanished, the inevitable questions would follow. About where she had been, about who she had been seeing, about the secret trip to Boston, about the pawned jewelry, about George Griscom. All the carefully maintained walls of respectability that the Arnold family had built over generations would come crashing down in a tide of tabloid speculation. So instead of calling the police, they hired private detectives. Specifically, and this is significant, they hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency. This was not some fly-by-night operation. The Pinkertons were the most famous, most powerful private detective agency in American history. They had prevented an assassination attempt on Abraham Lincoln. They had solved some of the most high-profile cases of the 19th century. If anyone could find Dorothy Arnold quietly, without attracting public attention, it was the Pinkertons. Multiple Pinkerton detectives were assigned to the case immediately. They began by doing what investigators always do. They retraced Dorothy's movements. They confirmed the chocolates. They confirmed the bookstore. They confirmed the conversation with Gladys King. And then they hit a wall. Beyond the corner of 5th Avenue and 27th Street, nothing. The Pinkertons developed multiple theories, starting with the one that Frances Arnold considered most likely: elopement. Had Dorothy run away with George Griscom? Had she finally escaped her controlling father's house and gone to marry the man she loved? Pinkerton investigators checked ship manifests for transatlantic crossings. They traveled to Europe. They visited the Marriage License Bureau and pored over records. They followed every lead they could generate. Nothing. Griscom himself, when the Arnold family reached him by telegram on December 16th, he was vacationing with his parents in Florence, Italy, denied any knowledge of Dorothy's whereabouts. He claimed the last communication he had from her was a letter dated November 26th, in which she had written about the rejection from McClure's. He seemed genuinely shocked by the news of her disappearance.
But here's a question that has nagged investigators for over a century. George Griscom received a telegram from the Arnold family on December 16th, informing him that Dorothy was missing. He was in Florence with his parents. Why did he not come home immediately? Why did he not race back to America to help find the woman he supposedly loved? Instead, he stayed in Italy. He wrote letters from Europe. He provided information from a distance. And the Arnold family, for reasons that were never fully explained, seemed almost relieved to hear that Griscom was in Florence, and apparently had no direct knowledge of where Dorothy was, almost as if confirming his absence was more important than securing his help. Meanwhile, 1 month passed. Dorothy Arnold had been missing for a full month, and the police had not been told a single word. It was December 13th when the family found out she was gone. It was January 25th, 1911, 43 days later, before the New York City Police Department was officially notified. 43 days. In a missing persons case, where every hour of delay potentially destroys evidence, loses witnesses' memories, and closes doors that can never be reopened. When the NYPD finally was informed, the reason wasn't that the Arnold family had suddenly decided justice mattered more than reputation. The reason was that the Pinkerton Detective Agency, after 6 weeks of intensive investigation, had come up empty-handed, and had finally persuaded a deeply reluctant Frances Arnold to go public. The press conference was held on January 25, 1911, in Frances Arnold's own office. And what happened next demonstrated exactly why the Arnolds had feared going public. The story exploded. By January 26, 1911, Dorothy Arnold's face was on the front page of the New York Times. Within days, it was on the front pages of newspapers across the country. The New York Times called it one of the city's greatest mysteries. The tabloids went further, much further. Reporters dug into every aspect of Dorothy's private life with the relentless energy of people who understood that this was not just a missing person story. This was a sensation. A wealthy heiress, a secret lover, a controlling father, a family that had hidden the disappearance for over a month. This had every ingredient for a scandal that would captivate readers from coast to coast. The family offered a reward of $1,000, equivalent to more than $34,000 today, for any information leading to Dorothy's recovery. It was never claimed. Within weeks of the press conference, reporters had uncovered the story of the secret trip to Boston. They reported on George Griscom. They described the pawned jewelry, the Hotel Essex, the private post office box, the rejected writing career. Piece by piece, they dismantled the carefully constructed image of Dorothy Arnold as a conventional society girl, and revealed a far more complicated, far more sympathetic figure. A young woman who was desperately trying to build a life of her own in a world that had no interest in letting her. Frances Arnold told reporters, with the flat certainty of a man who had made up his mind, "I am firmly convinced my daughter has been killed, and I will spend every dollar I have in the world to avenge her death." His wife Mary was less certain. She had always hoped Dorothy might have left voluntarily, had run away to live the independent life she had always wanted. That possibility, however painful, was easier to live with than the alternative. The leads poured in, as they always do when a case becomes national news. Thousands of tips, hundreds of claimed sightings. Dorothy Arnold was reportedly spotted in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in San Francisco, in London, in Paris. Every one of these leads was investigated. Every one went nowhere. Then, in early February 1911, something genuinely strange happened. Frances Arnold received a postcard. It was postmarked New York City. It was signed
Dorothy, and it contained just 4 words: "I am safe." A handwriting expert analyzed the postcard against samples of Dorothy's known writing and confirmed that the handwriting appeared to match. Francis Arnold, however, refused to believe it was genuine. He insisted that someone had used Dorothy's handwriting samples, which had by now been widely published in newspapers, to forge the postcard. A cruel joke. Maybe he was right. But it's also worth noting that Francis Arnold was a man with very powerful reasons to believe his daughter was dead rather than alive. If Dorothy was dead, she was a victim. If Dorothy was alive, if she had run away, then she had chosen to leave. And a father who had forbidden her career, mocked her ambitions, refused her independence, and controlled every aspect of her existence, might find that possibility rather more uncomfortable to confront. Around the same time as the postcard, a San Francisco jeweler came forward with another strange claim. He said that on January 7, 1911, almost a month after Dorothy disappeared, a woman who matched her description had visited his store. She had asked him to engrave a diamond wedding ring with the inscription, "To AJA from ERB, December 10, 1910. Nobody was ever able to identify who AJA or ERB were. The jeweler's claim was never definitively confirmed or refuted. The NYPD, which had been playing catch-up since entering the investigation 6 weeks late, eventually announced in February 1911, just 75 days after Dorothy vanished, that they were effectively closing their active investigation. Deputy Police Commissioner William J. Flynn stated publicly, "That now seems the only reasonable way of looking at the case. The girl has now been missing for 75 days, and in all that time, not a single clue has been found that was worth the name." 75 days. And the New York City Police Department was walking away. The case didn't die, of course. Cases this extraordinary never fully die. But for years, it simmered, occasionally producing a new headline, a new claimed sighting, a new theory, before fading back into the background of New York City history. Until 1916. 5 years after Dorothy Arnold walked away from Brentano's books and into history, a man sitting in a Rhode Island prison decided he had something to confess. His name was Edward Glenorris, sometimes spelled Glenorris in historical documents, and he was serving time for attempted extortion. He told the prison warden that in December 1910, he had been paid $250 to transport and bury the body of a young woman. His story, as he told it, went like this. A man he knew only as Little Louie had approached him with a job. Glenorris was to drive a car from New Rochelle, New York, to a house in Weehawken, New Jersey. Payment? $250. No questions asked. When Glenorris arrived at the meeting point in New Rochelle, he found Little Louie there, along with 2 other men. One of them went by the name Doc. The other was described only as wealthy and well-dressed. In the car was an unconscious woman. During the drive to Weehawken, Little Louie told Glenorris the identity of the unconscious woman, Dorothy Arnold. He also told Glenorris to notice the ring on her finger. It was a signet ring, one that Dorothy was known to have been wearing on the day she disappeared. According to Glenorris's account, the woman was transported to a house in Weehawken. Glenorris was instructed to return the next day, at which point he would be required to help dispose of the body permanently. When Glenorris returned the following day, Dorothy Arnold was already dead. And he buried her, somewhere in Weehawken, New Jersey. This was a stunning claim. If true,
It meant Dorothy Arnold had been abducted, drugged, and murdered, not on some isolated street, but on one of the busiest avenues in New York City, in broad afternoon daylight. Investigators examined Glenoris's story carefully. There were elements of it that were genuinely troubling, particularly the detail about the signet ring, which was not widely known to the public, and which Glenoris could theoretically have only known if he had actually seen Dorothy. But there were also serious problems with his account. Glenoris was a convicted criminal, already serving time. He had every reason to seek attention, to bargain for better treatment, or simply to inject himself into a famous case. He could not provide a precise location for the burial. The wealthy and well-dressed man who matched Griscom's description, Griscom himself, was eventually ruled out. And no body was ever found in Weehawken, despite investigators' efforts. Glenoris's confession was ultimately deemed unreliable, and no charges were ever filed based on his statements. But it planted a seed of suspicion and a possible theory of murder that has never entirely gone away. Here is one of the most overlooked details of the entire Dorothy Arnold case, and in some ways, one of the most chilling. In 1921, a full decade after Dorothy's disappearance, NYPD Captain John H. Heiress, the head of the Bureau of Missing Persons, made a stunning public announcement. He said the Dorothy Arnold case had been solved. He said Dorothy Arnold was no longer considered a missing person. The Arnold family was blindsided. They were furious. They publicly demanded to know what he meant, what information he had, what had happened to their daughter. Captain Heiress then did something extraordinary. He immediately walked back his statement. He claimed he had only meant that the family might have resolved the matter privately, that perhaps they had discovered the truth and chosen not to share it publicly. But the damage, as the saying goes, was done. The public was now convinced that there was a cover-up, that someone, the Arnold family, the police, or both, knew more than they were saying. And the suspicious silence from both institutions only deepened this conviction. Dorothy's parents both died in the 1920s without ever publicly addressing what had happened to their daughter. Her father, who had once promised to spend every dollar he owned to avenge her death, left behind no public statement of any resolution, no explanation of Heiress's bizarre announcement. Nothing. What did Heiress know? Who had told him the case was resolved? These questions have never been answered. And the Arnold family's silence on the subject has been maintained, with remarkable consistency, for over a century. Dorothy's great-niece, Jane Vollmer, didn't even learn about the case until she was in her 30s, when she stumbled across a newspaper column about true crimes and recognized her own family name in the headline. Her mother, born 5 years after Dorothy disappeared, had apparently never once mentioned it. A woman of Vollmer's generation, speaking to National Geographic in recent years, captured the family's attitude perfectly. "My grandmother would be absolutely horrified to have all this dug up 100 years later." That sentence might be the most revealing one in this entire story. Not, "I hope we find out what happened someday." Not, "Dorothy deserved better," but horror at the prospect of the story being revisited. The primary emotion, even a century later, is one of social embarrassment, of reputation. The same emotion that delayed the police notification by 43 days. The same emotion that led to private detectives instead of public investigation. The same emotion that had characterized the Arnold family's response to Dorothy's disappearance from the very first moment. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of secret is so shameful, so damaging, so potentially catastrophic to a family's reputation that more than a century of silence is the price they're willing to pay? More than 114 years have passed since Dorothy Arnold disappeared on Fifth Avenue, In that time, investigators, historians, journalists, and true crime researchers have proposed numerous theories. Let's examine each one seriously. The first theory is suicide. This is the one that Dorothy's own family, particularly her father, eventually came to privately accept. The evidence for it is real and worth taking seriously. Dorothy was, by November 1910, in a state of genuine despair. Her writing career had been rejected twice by the most prestigious magazine she could reach. Her father had refused her independence. Her relationship with the only man she apparently loved had been forbidden. Her family mocked her ambitions. In her last known letter to Griscom, she had written, "Failure stares me in the face. All I can see is a long road with no turning." She also wrote in that same letter, "Mother will always think an accident has happened." Some read that sentence as Dorothy telegraphing her intention to end her life, essentially telling Griscom, "When I'm gone, my mother will believe it was an accident, but I want you to understand the truth." The problem with the suicide theory is simple. No body was ever found.
Now, it is technically possible for a body to disappear, particularly in a city like New York, where the Hudson and East Rivers were not nearly as monitored in 1910 as they are today. Bodies went into the rivers and were never recovered. Suicides in Central Park were not unheard of. But the complete absence of any physical evidence, no body, no clothing, no belongings, is difficult to explain if Dorothy had simply ended her life in or near Central Park on a December afternoon. The second theory is that she ran away. This is the theory that Dorothy's mother always secretly preferred, and it is, in many ways, the most emotionally satisfying one. The scenario: Dorothy, exhausted and desperate, made a spontaneous decision to simply walk away from her life. She had $30 in her pocket, enough to make initial arrangements. She might have contacted Griscom, arranged a meeting, and the two of them disappeared together to start a new life, somewhere outside the reach of her controlling family. Or she might have done it entirely alone, reinventing herself somewhere far from New York, perhaps under a different name, finally building the independent writing life she had always dreamed of. The postcard, "I am safe," could have been genuine. The San Francisco jeweler's sighting could have been real. Against this theory, she left her passport at home. She left all her jewelry. She made no apparent financial preparations. And if she ran away with Griscom, why did he, apparently genuinely shocked by the telegram, behave as though he knew nothing? Unless the shock was performed. Unless Griscom was a better actor than anyone gave him credit for. The third theory involves a botched medical procedure. This one gained significant traction in the 1910s and has never entirely gone away. Dorothy had been involved in a secret romantic relationship with a much older man. She had spent a week alone with him in a hotel room just 3 months before her disappearance. It is possible, not certain, but possible, that she was pregnant. In 1910, abortion was illegal, but not uncommon among wealthy women who could afford to pay for a discreet procedure from a private physician. The theory holds that Dorothy sought out a provider for such a procedure, that something went wrong, medically or otherwise, and that either she died during or after the procedure, or she was deliberately killed by someone who wanted to prevent a scandal. This theory would explain several elements of the case: the family's frantic desire for secrecy, the refusal to involve police, the apparent knowledge by someone in authority of what had actually happened, and the extraordinary and sustained silence of the Arnold family for generations. A dead daughter from a botched illegal procedure was not just a personal tragedy in 1910 New York. It was a potentially criminal matter, touching on illegal abortion, possibly manslaughter, and most certainly on the kind of moral scandal that would destroy a family's social standing permanently. If this is what happened, the Arnold family had powerful reasons, legal as well as social, to bury the truth. And in a very real sense, they may have. The fourth theory is murder. Glenorris's 1916 prison confession gave this theory a detailed and specific narrative, even if his account was never verified. And the idea of murder, that Dorothy was attacked, abducted, or killed somewhere between Brentano's books and Central Park, has never been entirely dismissed. Fifth Avenue in 1910 was crowded, but crowded doesn't mean safe. The kidnapping and trafficking of women was documented in that era. A well-dressed young woman walking alone through Manhattan, even on one of its busiest streets, was not immune to targeted violence from someone who had been watching her, following her, waiting for an opportunity. If Dorothy was abducted quickly and efficiently, bundled into a car at a quiet moment, witnesses might have assumed she was simply getting into a cab. In the days before ubiquitous photography and surveillance, such a thing was entirely possible. The problem is, who? Why Dorothy specifically? What motivation would anyone have for targeting her? Griscom remains the most obvious candidate in any murder theory, simply because he was her secret lover, and the person with the most to lose from any potential scandal. But he was in Italy when she disappeared, and no evidence has ever connected him to her disappearance in any direct way. The fifth theory is accident with amnesia or injury. One 1910-era proposal suggested that Dorothy might have slipped on the icy pavement, struck her head, suffered a concussion and resulting amnesia, and, in a confused state, wandered away from Fifth Avenue without knowing who she was. She might have been taken in by strangers or committed to an institution under a false name, unable to identify herself. While this scenario is medically possible, it struggles against the scale of the search that followed. Hospitals were checked. Institutions were examined, with her photograph in every newspaper in the country. If Dorothy had been alive anywhere in America and recognizable, someone would likely have come forward. Unless she was being deliberately hidden. Unless someone who found her chose not to report it. This theory, too, ultimately disappears into the same fog that surrounds everything else in this case. Let us pause here and focus on several specific details that have never been satisfactorily explained, because they're the kind of details that make this case genuinely extraordinary rather than simply sad. Shortly after Dorothy's disappearance, investigators examining her room at the family home found evidence that papers had been recently burned in the fireplace. What papers? Nobody ever identified them. Had Dorothy burned correspondence before leaving? Had someone else burned them after her disappearance, perhaps to destroy evidence of her writing, her relationship, or something else entirely? This detail has never been explained. Then there is the 43-day delay itself. It simply cannot be justified in any reasonable reading of the evidence. If you believe Dorothy was murdered, or died in an accident, or ended her own life, then 43 days without police involvement is a catastrophic, possibly criminal failure that may have destroyed the only evidence that could have led to the truth. The Arnold family's lawyer, their private detectives, their social connections, all of it was deployed in service of secrecy, not in service of finding Dorothy. Then there is Captain Ayres' 1921 announcement, a senior NYPD official, a decade after the disappearance, publicly stating the case had been resolved, then immediately retracting the statement under pressure. Where did that information come from? What had the police learned? Who had told them? The fact that this statement was made at all suggests that at some point, someone in a position of authority believed they knew what had happened to Dorothy Arnold. That knowledge, if it existed, died with those individuals and was never made part of the public record. And then there is Griscom's behavior. George Griscom Jr. died in 1966, more than 50 years after Dorothy disappeared, without ever publicly saying anything substantive about their relationship or her disappearance beyond his initial denials in 1911. In half a century, he gave no interviews, wrote no memoir, offered no new information. For a man who claimed to have deeply loved Dorothy Arnold, his silence was remarkable. Finally, there is the signet ring. Norris's detail about the ring, a specific piece of jewelry Dorothy was wearing on the day she disappeared, is the most troubling element of his otherwise questionable testimony. If he invented his story from newspaper accounts, this particular detail is surprisingly specific and not widely reported. How did he know about the ring? Dorothy Arnold's case holds a distinction that no other missing persons investigation in New York City shares. It is, officially, the oldest active missing persons case in the city's history. More than 114 years after she walked away from Brentano's books on Fifth Avenue, Dorothy Arnold has never been officially declared dead. No body has been found. No perpetrator has been charged. No explanation has been confirmed. Her parents both died in the 1920s, her father in 1922, her mother in 1928, without ever publicly resolving the question of what happened to their daughter. Whatever Francis Arnold believed in his heart, whether he suspected murder, whether he knew more than he ever revealed, he took it to his grave. In 1921, New York courts finally declared Dorothy Arnold legally dead. By that point, she had been missing for 11 years. But legal death is not the same as explanation. It is not the same as closure. It is not the same as knowing. Dorothy Arnold's great-niece, Jane Vollmer, speaking to journalists in the modern era, has acknowledged that the family possesses no secret knowledge of what happened. No smoking gun hidden in a private archive. No confession passed down through generations. If the Arnold family knows something, it is buried so deeply that even their own descendants cannot access it. And yet, the silence is too deliberate. The delay is too calculated. The lawyer and the private detectives and the desperate avoidance of publicity, all of it adds up to something that smells, even a century later, like a family that was protecting itself as much as it was searching for a daughter. Whether Dorothy Arnold is a tragic victim of violence, a heartbroken young woman who chose to disappear, or something more complicated and more human than either of those stories, we may never know. What we do know is that she deserved better. Step back from the details for a moment and look at the larger picture, because Dorothy Arnold's story is about more than one woman's disappearance. It is about the particular way that wealth and power operate when they collide with tragedy. In 1910, the Arnold family had every resource in the world at their disposal. They had money, connections, the Pinkerton detective agency, a family lawyer, and enough social influence to delay a police investigation for over 6 weeks in a major metropolitan city. They used every single one of those resources, not primarily to find Dorothy, but to manage the public narrative around her disappearance. Think about what a family without those resources would have done. They would have called the police immediately. They would have had no choice. Their daughter's disappearance would have been investigated from day one. Evidence would have been preserved. Witnesses would have been interviewed while memories were fresh. And whatever happened in those first 43 days might have led somewhere. the Arnolds made a different choice. And whether that choice ultimately destroyed the possibility of solving the case, whether it allowed a killer to escape, or a secret to be buried, or evidence to be destroyed, is something that cannot be known. But it is not a coincidence that the oldest unsolved missing persons case in New York City history belongs to one of New York's most powerful families. In some ways, Dorothy Arnold's story is as much about what money cannot do as what it can. It could not give her the freedom she wanted. It could not give her a writing career. It could not give her the man she loved. And when she vanished, all the wealth and influence in the Arnold family's arsenal could not find one trace of what had become of her. Or perhaps, and this is the darkest reading of all, perhaps it could have. Perhaps the truth was findable in those first crucial hours and days. Perhaps the delay cost them everything. Dorothy Arnold left her home on a cold December morning with $30 in her purse, a book of short stories under her arm, and a box of chocolates. She stopped to talk to a friend on a busy street. She said she was going to walk through Central Park. And then she stepped off the map of recorded history and into one of the most enduring mysteries that New York City, or any American city, has ever produced. 114 years later, we have theories but no answers. We have questions but no resolutions. We have the outline of a young woman who wanted more than the world she was born into. More independence, more creativity, more freedom, and who found the walls of that world too high to climb. Or perhaps she found a door that no one else could see, and walked through it. The postcard, if it was real, said simply, "I am safe." I want to believe that. I think a lot of people who study this case want to believe that. That Dorothy Arnold, brilliant, restless, trapped Dorothy Arnold, somehow found her way out. That she went somewhere and became someone, wrote her stories and lived her life, and smiled at the thought of her disappearance puzzling New York for decades to come. Maybe she did. Or maybe the silence of an extraordinarily powerful family, maintained across more than a century and more than 4 generations, is not the silence of grief. Maybe it's the silence of guilt. We don't know. We may never know. But Dorothy Arnold was here. She walked these streets. She dreamed these dreams. And whatever happened to her on that December afternoon in 1910, she deserved to have someone fight for her harder than her family's reputation allowed. That's the Dorothy Arnold story. And it's still not over.